So I'm just going to present a series of slides to paint a picture of the impact of the crisis and then talk about the response to it and with some commentary on what I think would be the best way to go from a policy perspective, particularly with a focus on fiscal policy. So, as we know, the Spanish flu 100 years ago was devastating, and perhaps more devastating in terms of mortality rates than COVID, but COVID has had very serious effects health-wise. I'm going to refer to the COVID crisis as the CVC. It strikes me as curious that we're always using that long term. When the global financial crisis occurred, we used the acronym GFC, so I like to call this the CVC, which of course we know has wreaked havoc on the world economy. And as a macroeconomist, when this first struck, I pondered about the actual mechanics of it. How do we analyse the shock, major shock? And it was most unusual in the sense that it was a government mandated shock in large part, particularly in advanced economies when there were lockdowns of economies by government decree at in federal states like Australia. It was at the federal level and also mostly at the state level. And as was the case in the US, the United States had the states with their autonomous powers doing the locking down, which really greatly harmed industry. So, and employment in particular. So our concern has been the high unemployment that's occurred as a consequence of this this serious suppression of economic activity. So thinking about it, I've sort of thought of it as a simultaneous aggregate supply and aggregate demand shock caused by deliberate government action, which disrupted supply chain and greatly altered expectations on the part of household and business about consumption and investment. So just a way to those of you who have done a bit of elementary macroeconomics could relate to this framework. And I'm going to be using some of the tools of elementary macroeconomics to throughout this presentation. So there we were in equilibrium with the aggregate supply and aggregate demand, solid aggregate supply and aggregate demand schedules, given price level, given level of output. And we can think of this for the world or for our individual economies impacted by the lockdowns. So the lockdowns caused primarily in the first instance a shrinkage of aggregate supply, but accompanying that, of course, due to the uncertainty and the inability of people to go out and spend in some cases, particularly in Australia, there was a big impact on international tourism, which affected industries in that sector. Tertiary education, Australia's had a lot of foreign students here. They were prohibited from entering the country. So there were some sectors that were very severely impacted by the crisis, and the overall uncertainty impacted general business investment, the big I in the national accounts, and the big C, consumption in the national accounts. So that's one way of thinking about it, that it was almost a supply shock, but with accompanying aggregate demand collapse. And of course, that caused the recession, and price levels actually went down in Australia as a consequence of that. So from that point of equilibrium, where we've been until fairly recently, the recovery is going to depend on the recovery of demand and supply. So what we've seen in Australia is a fairly quick bounce back on the supply side as restrictions have been lifted, and they were very heavily imposed in some states. Victoria in particular was in lockdown for an extended period. But as the restrictions have been lifted, we've seen activity come back, And I've used the analogy of stepping on a coiled spring. So the government stepped on a coiled spring, which is the economy, and kept it down. And once they took the foot off, then the spring, it bounced back. Not fully, of course, but it bounced back, and spending has also come back. So there's been a surge in spending. Some say this is a result of pent-up demand, but also due to various stimulus measures. And I'll come to that issue later in the discussion about the pros and cons of the conscious stimulus measures. But let me just talk about the impact, and you'll find these charts in the paper that that accompanies this presentation. So the impact was greatest on the advanced economies, on the OECD economies, European economies, some very badly affected, UK and Italy in particular, very badly affected by COVID-19. But it's been global. It's been global, and there we see, just how it's affected different country groupings in a relative sense. So the grey line is the fall in GDP last year, 2020. The yellow line is showing the bounce back, and this is based on forecasts of the IMF. The forecast there is for a fairly sharp recovery in this this calendar year. So that's just a projection, and a little bit unclear to me just how much policy response was factored in to that projection, which is fairly recent. But of course, policies are forever changing, and the most notable one, of course, is the massive stimulus implemented or about to be implemented by the new Biden administration in the US, a very big fiscal stimulus, which perhaps wasn't factored into these forecasts. So there we see the behaviour of the world economy. That's the upper blue line, the light blue line, and just comparing the impact on advanced economies, as I said, were worst hit. So you do see there a V-shaped recovery. There were all sorts of propositions about what the recovery would look like, whether it would be an inverted L, whether it would be a W, whether it would be a Nike swoosh symbol. All sorts of geometric shapes were proposed by economists speculating on what the recovery would look like. But it looks as if this is the way it is progressing. It looks like it is a V-shaped recovery, and we hope that the right side of the V is quite steep. In fact, ideally, that happens quickly. So just looking at the response in a broad sense, the macroeconomic response on the part of governments worldwide, and different countries did different things. Different countries did more of one kind of response than others. The IMF has an excellent website that catalogues all of the responses of member countries, very comprehensive. If you're interested to see how countries compare, how your own country responded, check that out. It's very useful. So of the elements of the response, of course, the health spending on the fiscal side was obviously essential to save lives, to administer care and make sure hospitals were in order and employ more staff for that purpose. But then there were the strictly macro responses that were aimed at allowing businesses to survive and to stop unemployment rising too quickly and to levels that were too high. So monetary policy through central banks was very relaxed. Liquidity was eased. Loans were provided through central banks or underwritten by central banks to businesses, and also in Australia there were concessions for home borrowers, those with loans that had lost their jobs were given were allowed concessional conditions, temporary period through the height of the crisis. So monetary policy has provided support for both aggregate supply and demand. On the employment front, wage subsidy programs have been adopted in many countries, not all. Australia, New Zealand, I know, Singapore, I think as well, UK and US, I think all those countries had some form of a wage subsidy program, which meant that governments were allowing employees to be kept on through a subsidy paid out of the budget. Yeah, and that was a curious initiative that we've not seen the likes of ever before on my reading of economic history. It was fiscal policy, but really it was fiscal policy aimed at the supply side of the economy to keep firms afloat and to allow them to maintain employment. So it was a bit like a lifeboat for firms, and hence, in that sense, it was more an aggregate supply initiative than an aggregate demand initiative. And it certainly was successful in Australia, which I can speak most authoritatively about in terms of how these things played out in a particular economy. It certainly kept unemployment much lower than it would have been otherwise. And it's about to be phased out completely, that program. And here it was called the Job Keeper program. People were allowed to keep their jobs by virtue of this subsidy, but it did prove very expensive, which sent the budget into a very big deficit. I'll come to the fiscal implications shortly. So here we see, for the world as a whole, based on IMF data, just how the response and the impact of the CBC compared to the GFC. So when the GFC hit, that was again a most extraordinary shock and gripped economists and policymakers' attention, and there was a big response macroeconomically to counter the downturn, the economic downturn and unemployment that stemmed from that shock. If we look at the response to the CBC, we see it sort of it eclipses the response to the GFC. So the left panel there is the GFC years, the worst of them, 2008, 9, and 10. And on the right panel, we see comparatively a bigger response, or a bigger impact, I should say, because some of this just reflected loss of revenue, people losing jobs, less tax coming in, companies not surviving, less company tax. So there's a revenue hit there, as well as the expenditure increase. So we see how it's been far more impactful than the GFC. And the measures themselves that were implemented on the fiscal side, so I'm going to focus mainly on the fiscal side from here in, as the paper does. They fell into two broad categories. There was the direct impact on budgets through additional government spending and the loss of tax revenue. Also, the goods and services tax revenue, VAT revenue, fell because there was less spending in the economy. So there was the direct effect on budgets from the loss of revenue and the increased government spending. And then, of course, there was the support provided through loans and guarantees. And this is, I think, an interesting comparison that shows that loans and guarantees and equity injections actually were greater in advanced economies than they were in the other economies, in less developed economies. The first panel there, emerging market economies, the second panel, and then the G20 shown separately as well, due to the weight of advanced economies in the G20. We see that for the G20 as a whole, loans and equity injections and guarantees were slightly bigger than for the G20. In Australia's case, it was the opposite. It was certainly more on the blue bar side there than on the orange bar side. It was far more direct government support in Australia's case than in other countries. And here we see a breakdown of the change to the fiscal balances. So remember, the grey line is the year that the CBC hit or occurred. That was 2020 calendar year, and massive impact on budgets, particularly, again, similar sort of story, bigger for advanced economies than for emerging economies and less developed economies. But you see that was a very sharp increase for the world, 14% GDP, extraordinarily high budget deficits. So of course, when budget deficits occur, there has to be extra borrowing by governments, and extra borrowing means more public debt. So the consequence of this CVC has been that we're going to have escalating public debt, or very high public debt, for the foreseeable future. And again, far greater impact from the CVC than the GFC. So in Australia's case, public debt could double to over $1 trillion within a few years in the absence of substantial budget repair. So a doubling within a few years of the pre-existing stock of public debt for Australia in the Australian case. And that's just a reflection of the big fiscal response and the impact of the CVC on the budget. And it's impacted not only at federal level in the case of Australia, but impacted heavily at state level as well. So the states have also run big budget deficits compared to their recent history and compared to what happened during the GFC. So I'll talk about the implications of that subsequently. But here we see what's happened to public debt, again, comparing GFC and CVC. So we saw the big spike there this is the change from the previous year. So very big spike in 2020, almost double what happened in the worst crisis year of GFC, almost double the spike. And then going forward, we still see increases. Which is going to add to the stock of public debt, but they've tapered down as the surge of spending and lost revenue dissipates. Again, looking at the stocks as a percent of GDP, we see the red lines there. The crisis years is the crisis year, the year that the worst of the CVC happened. That's last year, 2020. And the black line is this calendar year. So it's gone up slightly from last year to this year as a projection, because obviously the budget deficits are still in deficit, and we're going to get that additional public debt going forward until budgets are brought back under control. So again, it's the same story. The advanced economies have been worst affected in terms of the budgetary and public debt situation, reflected in G20, and emerging economies and less developed economies badly affected, but not to the same extent. So that brings us to the question of what to do at the point we are at now. A key question there is, should further fiscal stimulus be implemented? I put the word stimulus in quotes for reasons that might become clear as we proceed. And the answer to that question, if you asked President Biden, would be yes, well, we're doing it. We're stimulating the economy very significantly by further adding to the budget deficit, various programs that aim to stimulate US economic activity for the purpose of bringing down unemployment. And of course, it's just really a pure Keynesian response. Those of you who've done any macroeconomics will be aware of the work of John Maynard Keynes, his work written during the Great Depression in the 1930s, published in 1936, was really a thesis proposing that governments should spend their way out of recessed activities for the purpose of lowering unemployment. And that's how I would characterize pure Keynesian theory. The use of fiscal policy to increase government activity, increase economic activity as measured in GDP for the purpose of lowering unemployment. And Keynesianism certainly waned as an influence through particularly through the 70s and 80s and 90s, all the way up to the GFC. It had greatly lost its influence amongst policymakers and amongst academics. There were numerous Nobel Prize winners awarded to the likes of Robert Lucas and Thomas Sargent and others who really addressed, Milton Friedman was the first to do it, of course, really countered the influence of Keynesianism on macroeconomic theory and policy thinking. And of course, it came back strongly with the GFC. The GFC, we saw the resurgence of Keynesian thinking, and interestingly, it came as a bit of a shock to many academic economists, and they penned a letter to some most of the leading macroeconomists in the United States, opposed excess government spending for purposes of allowing the US economy to recover from the GFC. And in that letter, which you can find on the internet somewhere, they said that using fiscal policy for that purpose was a triumph of hope over experience, and they countered what they presumably thought was a myth that government spending in the Keynesian tradition had lifted the US out of the Great Depression. They denied that by saying in this letter that more government spending did not pull the US economy out of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was quite prolonged, and economists here in Australia have shown that Australia did not do as much as the US during the Great Depression, and we recovered more quickly as a consequence. So there's a literature on that. I won't dwell on that, but there is considerable dissent about the idea that government spending during the Great Depression lifted the economy of the US out of the Great Depression. So look, I've recently had a book published by Palgrave with this title, The Limits of Fiscal Policy, which I'm just going to draw on some points there, but also point out that if you're interested in exploring some of the issues I'm now going to canvass very briefly, you'll find a far more detailed and comprehensive account with reference to theoretical models, fairly straightforward theoretical models, a suite of them, which propose in unison that using fiscal policy in an activist way is likely to be ineffective in the medium to long term. And of course, some interesting quotes from history, one from the 1930s for the US. The Treasury Secretary of the US at the end of the 1930s made this comment that the government, we are spending more than we ever spent before, and it does not work. After 8 years of this administration, that was the administration of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt, public debt, to boot. So that was the conclusion of the Treasury Secretary in 1939. The Keynesian policies had not worked, and the UK Labor Prime Minister, decades later, after economies had experimented with Keynesianism through the 60s and 70s in particular, James Callaghan, former Prime Minister, said, we used to think we could spend our way out of recession. I can tell you in all candor that option no longer exists, and if it ever did exist, it only worked by injecting bigger doses of inflation into the economy, followed by higher levels of unemployment as the next step. That is the history of the past 20 years. So there's two leaders making very negative, dismissive judgments on the use of government spending as a tool for stimulus. And another interesting quote, I'm most interested in looking at how macroeconomic policy operates in open economies. A lot of the US literature is focused on closed economies, the presumption that the US is such a big economy, it's effectively the world economy, which is the way many American economists think, I have to say. But if you think about small open economies, of course, Australia is one, New Zealand is one, Malaysia is one, Singapore is one. Nearly all of the economies in Asia Pacific are small, except for Japan, China, and the US, possibly Indonesia. Yeah. So relatively speaking, economies tend to be small in size and very open, more open now than they were certainly in the 1930s when Keynes wrote his book. He assumed that the UK economy was closed. There's no exports, no imports, no exchange rates, and no public debt in theory either, no capital flows, which really suggests that it's not applicable to modern open economies. Yeah, and I like this quote. You'll find it prefacing one of the chapters that Hubert Henderson, who was a notable economist, UK economist, said in 1949, and it was paradoxical that this idea of assuming a closed economy had become so popular. And Adam Smith, the classical economist, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Bagehot, and Alfred Marshall would certainly have knit their brows. In other words, they'd be surprised that you can assume an economy is closed when you're looking at its behaviour. Okay. So in the simple, again now, I'm just going to use a little bit of very straightforward macro theory just to illustrate some points here about the ineffectiveness of fiscal policy as an instrument for stimulating economies from this point on. So in our basic textbook analysis of how economies work, we often start with the so-called Keynesian cross, which was actually popularized by Nobel Prize winning textbook writer Paul Samuelson. He actually invented this device called Keynesian cross, which I presume many of you may have seen in your macroeconomic study. But I'm going to present it with a bit of a twist.